In the modern history of the British royal family, you can survive a divorce. You can survive a tabloid scandal. But until recently, there was one crime that carried an immediate death sentence for your royal career: loving a Catholic. Meet George Windsor, Earl of St Andrews. Born high in the line of succession as the Queen's cousin and a royal duke's heir, he was placed close to the throne. But on a cold January day in 1988, he vanished from the line of succession. He wasn't exiled for treason, and he didn't abdicate in a blaze of glory. His removal was triggered by a 300-year-old clause in the British Constitution, what some commentators have called a silent guillotine, which took away his place in the succession when he signed the marriage register. This is the story of the prince who was forced to choose between his crown and his conscience. George Windsor was born on June 26, 1962, into a world that was already split in two. Outside the palace gates, the globe was on the precipice of a cultural revolution. The Beatles were in Hamburg, polishing the sound that would conquer the world. The Cold War was freezing over in Berlin. Kennedy was in the White House. There was a sense of kinetic energy, of boundaries breaking, of the old world dying to make way for the new. But inside Coppins, the country house in Buckinghamshire where George spent his early years, the clocks were set to a different time. Royal time is glacial. It moves in cycles of tradition, precedent, and protocol. George was the firstborn son of Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent, and Catherine Worsley, the Duchess of Kent. The Kents are the unsung pillars of the modern monarchy. If Queen Elizabeth II was the CEO of the firm, the Kents were her most loyal regional managers. Prince Edward, the Duke, was the Queen's first cousin. His father had been the younger brother of George VI and Edward VIII. He was a man defined by a stiff upper lip military discipline, a man who wore his uniform like a second skin and viewed duty not as a choice, but as a condition of existence. George's mother, Catherine, was different. She was a Worsley from a landed Yorkshire family, known for her warmth, her deep love of music, and a fragility that endeared her to the public even as it tormented her in private. She brought a human softness to the rigidity of the Kent household. Young George grew up in this dichotomy: the rigid military expectations of his father and the sensitive artistic soul of his mother. From the beginning, it was clear he took after Catherine. He was not a boisterous, knee-grazing royal tearaway. He was quiet. He was observant. He was the kind of child who preferred the company of a book to the chaos of a nursery. But hovering over his cradle, invisible to the nannies and the well-wishers, was the ghost of 1701. To understand the tragedy of George Windsor, you have to understand the Act of Settlement of 1701. To a modern ear, it sounds like a dry piece of legislation, something you might skim over in a history textbook. But in the DNA of the British royal family, it is the prime directive. The act was born in the ashes of the glorious, bloody religious wars of the 17th century. England had spent decades tearing itself apart over the question of whether a Catholic could sit on the throne. The Protestant Parliament, terrified of the return of the exiled Catholic Stuarts, who they believed would bring tyranny and subservience to the Pope, passed a law that was designed to be an ironclad firewall. It stated in language that brooked no argument that the monarch must be a Protestant in communion with the Church of England. But it went further. It didn't just regulate the king or queen, it regulated their hearts. The act declared that anyone who shall marry a papist would be subject to a civil death. They would be removed from the line of succession as if they had physically died. For nearly 3 centuries, this law sat there. It was the nuclear deterrent of the royal marriage market. It was effective. Royals simply didn't marry Catholics. It was the ultimate taboo, enforced by the threat of total social and constitutional erasure. By the 1960s and 70s, when George was growing up, this law felt like a medieval relic. Britain was changing. The sectarian violence of the past had faded in mainland Britain. Catholics were no longer viewed as potential traitors or agents of a foreign power. They were neighbors, colleagues, politicians, and friends. Yet, in the royal family, the mindset of 1701 persisted. The fear was institutionalized. The monarch is the supreme governor of the Church of England. The logic went that the monarch's family must be pure, untouched by the influence of Rome. As a young boy, George was likely taught this history and its significance for his family. Like other royals, he learned that his family owed their throne to this very act. The Hanoverians were invited to take the crown as the nearest Protestants, ahead of numerous Catholic claimants with a stronger hereditary claim. He existed because of the ban. But for a child, laws are abstract. They are things that happen to other people in other times. There was no obvious sign yet that this ancient piece of legislation would one day directly shape the course of his private life. George's education followed the standard blueprint for a royal male, but he inhabited the role differently. He was sent to Eton College, the foundry of the British ruling class. Eton is a place that can produce two types of men: the arrogant, blustering power broker, or the quiet, deeply intellectual stoic. George was firmly the latter. At Eton, while other boys were posturing for social dominance or excelling on the rugby pitch to impress their fathers, George was disappearing into the library. He discovered a profound love for history. This is a crucial psychological detail. George wasn't just living history. He wanted to understand it. He wanted to know why the world was the way it was. He studied the treaties, the wars, the religious schisms that had shaped Europe. There is a tragic irony here. By studying history so fervently, George was equipping himself to understand the very mechanism that would later exile him. He was learning the logic of his own doom. He was a serious royal. In the late 70s and early 80s, the younger generation of royals was beginning to generate headlines for the wrong reasons. There were whispers of parties, of girlfriends, of reckless behavior. But you never saw George Windsor in the gossip columns. He was the good cousin. He was the one the Queen never had to worry about. He stood on the balcony at Trooping the Color, tall, bespectacled, looking slightly uncomfortable with the pageantry, a man who seemed like he would rather be discussing the Treaty of Westphalia than waving to a crowd. This seriousness was partly a reaction to the pressures on his own family. The Kents were public servants, but they carried private burdens. His mother, the Duchess, suffered from severe depression, later diagnosed as connected to the Epstein-Barr virus and eventually celiac disease. She was a woman of immense feeling, who often found the rigid, unfeeling structure of royal life suffocating. George, the eldest son, watched this. He saw the toll that duty took on a sensitive soul. He saw that the glitter of the tiara often hid a migraine. It made him protective, and it made him skeptical of the superficial trappings of his rank. He didn't want the fame. He didn't want the adoration. He wanted substance. This desire for substance led him to Cambridge. Going to university is a rite of passage for many, but for a royal in the early 1980s, it was still a relatively novel concept, particularly the way George approached it. He didn't go to St Andrews or a smaller college to coast through an art history degree while playing polo. He went to Downing College, Cambridge, to read history. Cambridge in the 1980s was a world away from Buckingham Palace. It was a meritocracy of the mind. In the lecture halls and the seminar rooms, nobody cared who your grandmother was. They only cared if you could defend your argument on the causes of the French Revolution. If you were stupid, you were shredded. If you were smart, you were respected. For George, this was oxygen. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the Earl of St Andrews, the symbol of a dynasty. He was just George. He was a student with a formidable intellect, debating political theory, diving into international relations and proving to himself that his worth lay in his brain, not his blood. It was a period of intense liberation. He was shedding the skin of the prince. He was becoming a man. But as he delved deeper into the history of Europe, he was also walking unknowingly toward the edge of the cliff. The Act of Settlement doesn't care if you are a good student. It doesn't care if you are a loyal subject. It sits in the dusty law books waiting for a trigger. And the trigger is always the same: love. In the fairy tales, the prince goes out into the world to find a princess. In the Windsor reality, the prince goes out into the world and has to navigate a minefield of suitability. She must be aristocratic. She must be virgin. She must be scandal-free. And above all, she must be Protestant. George wasn't looking for a suitable bride. He wasn't looking for a debutante who looked good in a hat and knew how to cut a ribbon. He was looking for an intellectual equal. He was looking for someone who understood the complexities of the world, someone who could challenge him, someone who lived in the realm of ideas. He didn't know it yet, walking across the manicured lawns of Downing College, huddled in his coat against the damp Fenland wind. But he was about to meet the person who would force him to choose between his heritage and his heart. He was about to meet a woman who represented everything the Act of Settlement feared: a foreign intellectual, a divorcée, and, most damning of all, a cradle Catholic. The ghost in the nursery was about to wake up. The tragedy of George Windsor's early life is not that he was rebellious, but that he was so thoroughly prepared for a role he would be forced to forfeit. He did everything right. He was the dutiful son, the diligent scholar, the quiet upholder of dignity. He respected the institution of the monarchy enough to study its history and understand its mechanics. But the institution does not reward understanding. It rewards compliance. As George stood on the threshold of adulthood at Cambridge, he was a perfect specimen of a modern prince, intelligent, serious, and loyal. But he was operating under a misconception. Like many in his position, he could treat his place in the line of succession as a given, a solid fact of his existence. In reality, the constitutional framework meant that in the eyes of British law, the church in which any future spouse took communion would matter as much as his royal blood. The trap was set, the law was waiting, and George was about to fall in love. If the library at Eton was where George Windsor learned the theory of history, the seminar rooms of Cambridge were where he collided with its reality. The year was 1987. George was 25 years old, a postgraduate student at Downing College, submerged in the complexities of international relations. He had successfully curated a life that was tantalizingly close to normal. In the medieval streets of Cambridge, he was not the Earl. He was simply a serious young man in a tweed coat, cycling over the cobbles, his head full of books. It was in this rarefied atmosphere, a world of damp wool, filter coffee, and high-minded debate, that he met Silvana Tomaselli. To understand why this meeting was so catastrophic for the royal status quo, you have to look at Silvana through the eyes of a 1980s courtier. If you were designing the perfect royal bride in a laboratory at Buckingham Palace, you would produce a girl from the English shires, Anglican, aristocratic, untouched by scandal and safely dull. Silvana was none of these things. She was a comet from a different universe. Born in Newfoundland, Canada, she carried the fire of her Austrian and Italian ancestry. She was not a debutante. She was a formidable academic, a historian of political theory who could dissect the works of Mary Wollstonecraft with forensic precision. She was worldly, she was divorced, and most fatally of all, she was a Roman Catholic. In the eyes of George Windsor, she was a revelation. Here was a woman who didn't care about his courtesy title or his grandmother's castles. She cared about his mind. Friends from that era describe a relationship that wasn't built on the superficial glamour of the society circuit, but on a meeting of souls. They were two intellectuals who found a sanctuary in each other. But in the eyes of the British Constitution, Silvana Tomaselli was a walking constitutional crisis. The realization of their predicament didn't happen in a single dramatic explosion. It was a slow creeping dawn. As their relationship deepened, moving from the library to dinner parties, from friendship to love, the forbidden equation began to take shape. George plus Silvana equals 0. It was a math problem written in 1701. The act of settlement was explicit. It didn't offer a loophole. It didn't offer a waiver for true love. It stated that if George married a Catholic, he would be, in the brutal language of the 18th century, naturally dead to the succession. For many in his position, this might have been the end of the affair. The pressure to conform in the royal family is tectonic. You are raised to believe that your place in the line of succession is not just a privilege, but a sacred trust. To voluntarily surrender it is seen as a dereliction of duty. But George was different. The very history he studied had taught him that institutions are often arbitrary, while human connection is rare and real. In the end, he did not end the relationship. Instead, he accepted that marrying Silvana would mean losing his place in the succession. The decision was made quietly. There were no press conferences. There were no weeping interviews. George simply informed his family that he intended to marry the woman he loved, and he accepted the price tag attached to her. The reaction of the royal family is a subject of much speculation, but the evidence suggests a surprising warmth amidst the legal ice. The Kents are a pragmatic clan. George's mother, the Duchess of Kent, herself a woman of deep spiritual sensitivity, likely saw the absurdity of the situation better than anyone. She didn't shun Silvana, she welcomed her. But the law was the law. The Queen, as the head of the state in the church, could give her personal blessing, but she could not wave a wand and suspend the act of Parliament. The machinery of exclusion had to grind on. The wedding date was set for January 9th, 1988. It was not to be a fairy tale wedding. There would be no carriage procession down the mall. There would be no Archbishop of Canterbury officiating in a cathedral. Because Silvana was divorced, the Church of England, at that time still rigid on the remarriage of divorcees, would not open its doors. So they went north, to Scotland. The choice of Scotland was symbolic and practical. Scottish marriage laws were distinct, and the atmosphere was less suffocating than London. They chose the Leith Registry Office, a modest building near the docks of Edinburgh. The morning of the wedding was crisp and cold. The press had gathered, but the mood was not one of national celebration. It was one of curiosity. They were there to see the prince who gave it all up. George arrived looking typically understated in a morning suit, but it was Silvana who captured the narrative. She didn't wear white. She wore a striking outfit of royal blue velvet, a suit, and a Cossack-style hat that looked both regal and defiant. The effect was of a woman who appeared entirely self-possessed. The ceremony was brief. It was a civil contract stripped of religious pomp. But the moment they signed the register, a second invisible legal mechanism clicked into gear in London. As George's pen lifted from the paper, his name vanished from the list of heirs to the throne. He had walked into the registry office as a potential successor to William the Conqueror. He walked out as a private citizen in the eyes of the succession. He was still the Earl of St Andrews, a title of nobility, but his dynastic role had quietly disappeared. The scene outside was telling. There were no cheering crowds waving Union Jacks. There was just a small group of family, including his mother, the Duchess, and his sister, Lady Helen, standing in the Scottish wind. They smiled and posed for photos, even though the legal consequences of the day were unmistakable. Here was a family celebrating a union that the state had just penalized. The short walk from the registry office to the waiting car marked a profound change in his constitutional status. He had crossed a Rubicon. He was now officially an outsider in his own house, but as he held Sylvana's hand, the forbidden equation resolved itself into a new reality. He had lost his place in line, yes, but he had gained a partner. The newspapers the next day were respectful but distant. They treated it as a quirk of the Constitution, a minor historical footnote. Earl weds Catholic, the headlines murmured. They missed the tragedy. They missed the fact that a man had been forced to choose between his faith in his country's laws and his faith in his own heart. George and Sylvana retreated immediately into their private life. They didn't try to monetize their story. They went back to Cambridge, back to the books, back to the silence. But the silence was not empty. It was pregnant with consequence. Because George and Sylvana weren't just a couple, they were about to become a family. And the curse of the act of settlement was not done with them yet. It was about to jump to the next generation. As Sylvana settled into married life as the Countess of St Andrews, she soon became pregnant, a development that would test the logic of the law even further. She would soon be pregnant, and the child she was carrying, a child with the blood of kings flowing in its veins, was destined to be born into the same constitutional exile as its father. The trap had snapped shut on George. Now it was waiting for his children. The morning after a revolution is usually quiet, but the silence that settled over the life of George Windsor in the late 1980s was heavy with a specific kind of British awkwardness. He had done the unthinkable. He had prioritized his conscience over the Constitution. Now the honeymoon was over, and the long, slow reality of his civil death began to set in. It is easy to romanticize the act of sacrifice when it happens in a flash of glory. But George's sacrifice was chronic. It was a condition he had to live with every day. As he returned to his books in Cambridge, now a married man, he was no longer just a student. He was a walking anomaly. He was the Earl of St Andrews, a man with a courtesy title that echoed through history, yet legally, he was a ghost. The royal family operates on a strict hierarchy of precedence. Who walks into the room first? Who bows to whom? Who stands where on the balcony? By losing his place in the line of succession, George had effectively been shuffled to the back of the deck. He was still a member of the family. He was still the Queen's cousin, but he had lost his magic. In the mystical logic of the monarchy, he was no longer a vessel for the crown. He was just a man. But if George thought the act of settlement was finished with him, he was wrong. The law of 1701 is not just a barrier, it is a contagion. In late 1988, the inevitable happened. George and Sylvana welcomed their first child, a son, Edward Edmund Maximilian. George Windsor, known as Baron Downpatrick. The birth of a firstborn son to an earl is usually a moment of dynastic triumph. Bonfires are lit, bells are rung. This boy was the future Duke of Kent. He carried the blood of Queen Victoria and George V. In a normal timeline, he would have entered the world high in the line of succession, a potential spare to the spare. But the question of his soul had to be answered before he could even lift his head. Sylvana was a devout Catholic. George was a devout Anglican who had married out of his tribe. They faced a decision that would determine their son's constitutional fate. In the Anglican tradition, the father's faith usually dictates the upbringing, but the Catholic Church requires a promise that children will be raised in the faith. It was a clash of titans, the Vatican versus the Crown. George and Sylvana chose consistency. They chose to raise their children in the faith of the mother. Little Edward was baptized into the Roman Catholic Church. Under the terms of the Act of Settlement, his baptism in the Roman Catholic Church meant that he too was excluded from the line of succession, just as his father had been. The Act of Settlement is ruthless in its precision. It states that anyone who professes the popish religion is dead to the throne. Edward, a baby who couldn't yet speak, let alone profess a theology, was struck from the list. This happened twice more. In 1992, their daughter, Lady Marina, was born, baptized Catholic, removed. In 1995, Lady Amelia followed, baptized Catholic, removed. By the mid-1990s, the combined effect of his marriage and his children's Catholic baptisms meant that his immediate branch of the family had been removed from the line of succession. He, his wife, and his 3 children were all out. They were a quarantined unit within the House of Windsor, a family of 5 who were allowed to attend the Christmas lunch at Sandringham, but were legally judged unfit to wear the crown because of how they prayed. To the outside observer, this might seem like a trivial technicality. Who cares about being 30th or 40th in line? But in the world of royalty, where blood and right are the currencies of existence, this was a profound stigma. It was a statement by the state that George's family was infected. It was a lingering echo of the days when Catholics were burned at the stake, now sanitized into a bureaucratic crossed-out line in a ledger. However, as the 1990s progressed, a bitter irony began to emerge. While George and Sylvana were living their quiet, disgraced life in Cambridge and later in modest homes, the approved core of the royal family was imploding. This was the era of the War of the Waleses. The marriage of Prince Charles and Princess Diana, the perfect Protestant match, sanctioned by the Archbishop and the state, was disintegrating in a fireball of tabloid scandals, leaked tapes, and public tears. The Duke and Duchess of York were toe-sucking their way onto the front pages. The Princess Royal was divorcing. The monarchy was burning down. And who were the arsonists? They were the ones who had followed the rules. They were the ones who were safely in the line of succession. Meanwhile, the outcast couple, George and Sylvana, were building a marriage of rock-solid stability. They were raising intelligent, polite children. They were pursuing careers. George in the diplomatic service, Sylvana in academia, that added value to the nation. To many observers, they looked closer to what a modern royal family might aspire to be: dignified, largely self-supporting, and free of major scandal. The juxtaposition was blinding. The Act of Settlement was supposed to protect the integrity of the crown, yet the people it excluded were the ones with the most integrity, while the people it protected were tearing the institution apart. And then in 1994 came the twist that nobody saw coming, a twist that originated from the heart of George's own childhood trauma. His mother, Catherine, the Duchess of Kent. The Duchess had always been the fragile beauty of the family. She was beloved by the public for her empathy. She was the royal who hugged the losing players at Wimbledon and looked like she truly meant it. But internally, she had battled severe depression and a sense of spiritual hollowness within the rigid Anglican structures of the court. She had watched her son George be penalized for loving a Catholic. She had watched her grandchildren be excluded. And perhaps in watching the quiet dignity of Sylvana's faith, She found something she was looking for. In 1994, the Duchess of Kent made a highly unusual announcement. She was converting to Roman Catholicism. It was a seismic shock. This wasn't a minor cousin. This was a royal duchess, the wife of the Queen's cousin, a woman who stood on the balcony at the center of the frame. For the first time since the Act of Settlement was passed in 1701, a senior member of the royal family was crossing the Tiber. The Queen, in a moment of characteristic grace that belied the rigidity of the system, gave her permission. "I approve," she reportedly said, "because it is right for her." But legally, it was a minefield. Because the Duchess was married into the family, her conversion didn't retroactively remove her husband, the Duke, from the line of succession. But the symbolism was nuclear. For George, his mother's conversion was an unmistakable public echo of the choice he had made years earlier. The woman who had given him life was now validating the choice that had cost him his birthright. To many, it seemed to underline that there was nothing inherently wrong with the faith for which her son had paid such a high constitutional price. The Duchess's conversion changed the atmosphere. Suddenly, Catholicism wasn't just the religion of the foreign wife, it was the religion of the beloved Duchess. It brought the absurdity of George's exclusion into sharper relief. If the Queen's own cousin-in-law could take Mass at Westminster Cathedral, why was her grandson banned from the throne for marrying someone who did the same? Emboldened by this shift, but still legally exiled, George focused on his work. He didn't sulk, he served. He joined the Foreign Office. It is a testament to his character that he chose to serve the British state as a diplomat, representing the very constitution that discriminated against him. He worked in New York and Budapest. He became an expert in international security and history. There is a specific kind of nobility in serving a system that rejects you. George became a working royal in the truest sense, not by cutting ribbons, but by filing reports, analyzing intelligence, and fostering international relations. He was the Earl of St Andrews by night, but by day, he was just a hard-working civil servant. His children grew up in this dual world. Edward, Marina, and Amelia were aware of their unique status. They were the Catholic Windsors. They were the cousins who attended the big events, the Golden Jubilee, the weddings, but who sat in a slightly different section, metaphorically speaking. But as the new millennium dawned, the silence around their exclusion began to crack. The UK was changing. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 had brought peace to Northern Ireland, dismantling much of the sectarian framework that had justified the Act of Settlement. The Human Rights Act was passed. The idea of discrimination based on religion was becoming legally and socially abhorrent. Legal scholars began to look at the Act of Settlement with fresh eyes. It looked like a dinosaur. It looked like a lawsuit waiting to happen. George, from his quiet corner, never sued. He never agitated. But his existence was a passive protest. Every time he stood in a church for a family christening, every time his name was mentioned in the court circular, it forced the question, why is this man not on the list? The pressure was building, not from the streets, but from the sheer undeniable weight of logic. The House of Windsor prides itself on adapting to survive. It had survived wars, abdications, and divorces, but could it survive the admission that its foundational law was a piece of bigoted history that belonged in a museum? By then, George Windsor had spent 2 decades living at a constitutional arm's length from the crown, raising his family just outside the invisible fence of succession. He had watched the drama of the monarchy unfold from the sidelines. But history has a way of circling back. The pen that had crossed his name out was about to be picked up again. The politicians were starting to whisper about reform. And for the Earl of St Andrews, the prince who lost his place for love, the long winter of his exclusion was showing the first faint signs of a thaw. By the time the new millennium had settled into its rhythm, the exclusion of George Windsor had transformed from a personal tragedy into a national embarrassment. The United Kingdom in the 2000s was a nation striving to present itself as a beacon of tolerance. It was the era of the Human Rights Act, of multiculturalism, of a society aggressively scrubbing away the prejudices of the past. Yet, at the very pinnacle of this modern state sat a law that was chemically pure discrimination. By the 2000s, the Act of Settlement of 1701 was increasingly seen as an anachronism within the modern British Constitution. It smelled of a time when priests were hunted and sectarian riots filled the streets, and standing next to this carcass, silently pointing at it by his very existence, was the Earl of St Andrews. George Windsor was now a middle-aged man. He had spent his entire adult life in the constitutional wilderness. He was a former diplomat, a scholar, a father, and a husband who had stayed faithful to his wife and his country. Yet in the eyes of the law, he was still naturally dead. The pressure to change this was not driven by a sudden surge of sympathy for George. The monarchy rarely moves for sentiment. It moves for survival. As Prince William grew into adulthood, a serious what-if scenario began to be discussed privately among officials and courtiers. What if the future king fell in love with a Catholic? Under the existing law, the monarchy would face a crisis that would make the abdication of 1936 look like a minor hiccup. William would either have to renounce the throne or renounce the woman. In the 21st century, forcing a king to choose between love and bigotry would likely shatter the institution entirely. George Windsor was the living case study of this nightmare. He was the warning sign. The whispers for reform began to coalesce into a shout. But changing the rules of the British monarchy is not like changing a parking law. The British Crown is not just British. It is the head of state for 15 other Commonwealth realms. Nations like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Jamaica. To change the succession, all 16 nations had to agree simultaneously. It was a diplomatic logistical nightmare. For years, politicians kicked the can down the road. It was too complicated. It was not a priority. George waited. He watched as governments came and went, each one promising modernization, each one failing to tackle the 1701 Act. Then came 2011. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was held in Perth, Australia. It was a gathering of prime ministers and presidents under the sunny skies of Western Australia. David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, arrived with a mandate to finally clean up the royal attic. On October 28, 2011, the announcement was made, the Perth Agreement. The headlines focused on the gender change. The rule that put younger brothers ahead of older sisters was scrapped. This was the Kate and William clause, ensuring their firstborn would be heir regardless of gender. But tucked away in the agreement was the George Windsor clause. The ban on marrying a Roman Catholic was to be scrapped. For George, watching the news from London, it marked the moment when his own experience was finally being addressed in law. A group of politicians in a conference center on the other side of the world had just decided to give him his life back. However, the wheels of constitutional law grind slowly. It took another 4 years for every Commonwealth Parliament to pass the necessary legislation. George remained in limbo, a man with a promise but no paper. Finally, on March 26, 2015, the Succession to the Crown Act, 2013, officially came into force. In that second, the ink in the royal ledger changed color. Section 2 of the Act was retrospective. It stated that anyone who had been disqualified from the succession solely because they married a Roman Catholic was treated as if the person had never been disqualified. It was a legal resurrection. George Windsor, Earl of St Andrews, blinked back into existence. After 27 years of being a constitutional ghost, he was suddenly, miraculously, number 34 in line to the throne. He hadn't divorced Silvana. He hadn't recanted his love. The state had simply admitted it was wrong, but this victory was laced with a bitter, lingering poison. And this is where the tragedy of George Windsor reveals its true complex depth. The new law was a compromise. It lifted the ban on marrying a Catholic, but it did not lift the ban on being a Catholic. The monarch must still be in communion with the Church of England. This meant that while George was restored, his children were not. Edward and Lady Marina were confirmed Catholics. They remained barred. They stayed on the blacklist. Only Lady Amelia, who had not yet been confirmed at that time, briefly held a theoretical spot. So the restoration was personal to George, but it did not save his dynasty. He was reinstated to a line that his own son could not inherit. He was restored personally, but the change did not alter the position of his Catholic children. There was no ceremony to mark his return. No apology was issued by Parliament for the decades of discrimination. George didn't ask for one. He simply resumed his place in the order of precedence, a quiet victory for dignity over dogma. But the psychological impact of those 27 years cannot be legislated away. George had spent his prime years, the years of ambition and definition, as an outcast. He had learned to build an identity that didn't rely on his royal status, because that status had been stripped from him. When he was dead to the throne, he had been free. He had pursued his intellectual interests without the intense scrutiny that falls on the heirs. Now that he was alive again, he was an elderly statesman of the family, a man who had seen the machinery of the monarchy from the underside. He had seen that the royal prerogative was fragile. He had seen that a man's birthright could be canceled by a politician's signature. And he had seen that the only thing that truly lasted, the only thing that the Act of Settlement couldn't touch, was the bond he had forged with Silvana. The restoration of George Windsor was a triumph of modernization, but it was also a reminder of the arbitrary cruelty of the system. The law had changed not because it was unjust to George, but because it was inconvenient for the future King William. George was once again a footnote in someone else's story. Yet to those who know the history, he is the protagonist. He is the man who beat the Act of Settlement. He didn't beat it with a sword or a lawsuit. He beat it by outlasting it. He waited in the cold for a quarter of a century, holding his wife's hand, until the world finally warmed up enough to let him back in. As 2015 faded, George Windsor walked back into the fold, a prince restored. But he walked with a limp, the invisible limp of a man who knows that in the House of Windsor, your blood is never entirely your own. History has a strange way of correcting itself. It rarely happens with a bang. Usually it happens with a whisper. On a rainy Tuesday or a quiet afternoon in Parliament, a gavel falls, and a century of injustice is wiped away. But for the human beings caught in the gears of that history, the correction often comes too late to change the life they have already lived. George Windsor, Earl of St Andrews, entered the third decade of the 21st century as a man fully restored to his rights, yet permanently changed by his wrongs. The Succession to the Crown Act of 2013 had legally bleached the stain from his marriage. He was back in the line of succession, but he returned to the fold not as a young prince full of potential, but as a man in his 50s, gray-haired, scholarly, and deeply settled in the life he had built outside the walls. The restoration was, in many ways, a ghost victory. It changed nothing about his daily reality. He did not suddenly move into Kensington Palace. He did not receive a taxpayer-funded security detail. He did not start cutting ribbons at supermarkets. He remained what he had become during his exile, a private citizen with a royal name. But as the House of Windsor entered its most turbulent era in living memory, the twilight of Elizabeth II and the dawn of Charles III, George's story took on a new, profound resonance. He became the anti-spare. While the world was captivated by the explosive exit of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, a saga defined by noise, interviews, Netflix documentaries, and public grievances, George Windsor stood as the silent counterpoint. Here was a man who had actually lost his birthright. Here was a man who had been institutionally discriminated against by his own family's laws for 27 years. If anyone might have felt entitled to publish a bitter memoir, it was the Earl of St Andrews. But George never spoke. He never complained. He never sold his story. In this silence, a new kind of dignity emerged. As the main branch of the royal family struggled with scandals, from Prince Andrew's catastrophic fall from grace to the Sussex schism, the Catholic branch of the Kents remained a fortress of stability. George and Sylvana, still happily married after 3 decades, were the quiet success story that the monarchy desperately needed but couldn't quite celebrate. The final irony of the Act of Settlement is that while it was designed to keep the monarchy pure and stable, the people it excluded turned out to be the most stable of them all. George's life today is a testament to the sovereignty of the soul. He serves as the Chancellor of the University of Bolton, a role that fits him like a glove. He is not a figurehead, he is an intellect. He gives speeches not on the glory of the empire, but on the importance of education, diplomacy, and history. He is a former diplomat who uses his skills to navigate the charitable sector, working with the SOS children's villages and organizations dedicated to preserving history. By all accounts, he lives quietly, often moving around London without attracting much public attention, and devotes his time more to academic and charitable work than to high-profile royal duties. But the legacy of the law that tormented him still lingers in the next generation. The tragedy of the half-measure reform of 2013 is most visible in his children. His son Edward, Baron Downpatrick, known as Eddie to his friends, is the first heir to a royal dukedom in centuries to be a confirmed Catholic. He is a fashion designer, a creative soul, a man who hikes in Scotland and lives a modern, secular life. Yet legally, he is still barred from the throne. His sister, Lady Marina, is also barred. His youngest daughter, Lady Amelia Windsor, a fashion model and influencer, was initially the only one to remain in the line of succession. However, she too was eventually confirmed into the Catholic Church, forfeiting her place. Today, despite their father's restoration, all 3 of George Windsor's children remain excluded from the throne by their faith. This absolute exclusion highlights the lingering absurdity of the royal rules. The state has admitted the ban on marrying a Catholic was wrong, but it still maintains that being a Catholic is a disqualifier for the top job. With his training as a historian, he is well placed to see how outdated these rules now look. He knows that these rules are vestiges of a dead world. His children have pursued their own careers and interests rather than any formal royal role, and appear to value that freedom more than any theoretical place in the line of succession. Because they were excluded, they were never subjected to the crushing weight of royal protocol. They didn't have to ask the Queen's permission to marry. They didn't have to choose approved careers. They could be designers, writers, travelers. George's exclusion, painful as it was, broke the chain of obligation. He took the blow so his children didn't have to. In September 2022, the death of Queen Elizabeth II marked the end of the world George was born into. The Queen had been the constant, the matriarch who had given her quiet blessing to George's marriage even when the law forbade it. At her funeral, George walked in the procession. He wore his mourning suit, his face etched with the specific grief of a nephew who had lost not just a monarch, but a protector. In that moment, surrounded by the pageantry of state, the gun carriage, the crowns, the orbs, George stood as a living bridge between the past and the future. He represented the old monarchy of duty and silence, but he also represented the new monarchy of diversity and modernization. He was the man who had integrated Catholicism back into the bloodline. When King Charles III was crowned in 2023, the focus was on slimming down the monarchy. The balcony was emptier. The Kents, George's father, the Duke, and his siblings, were slowly stepping back from public duties due to age. George Windsor will likely never be a working royal in the new reign. He is too old to start, and the model has changed. He will remain on the periphery, the Earl of St Andrews, a title that sounds grand but carries no power. But power is not the only metric of a life. As we look at the arc of George Windsor's narrative, from the boy born into a trap, to the student who chose love, to the outcast who served in silence, to the restored elder statesman, we see a victory that is invisible to the casual observer. The system tried to tell him that his worth was defined by a list. He proved his worth was defined by his character. The system tried to tell him that his marriage was invalid. He proved it was the most valid thing in his life. The system tried to erase him. He refused to fade away. George Windsor is the paper prince. On paper, he lost everything, but in reality, he kept the only things that matter. He kept his wife, he kept his conscience, and he kept his dignity. In a world of loud noises and shallow celebrities, the story of the Earl of St Andrews is a reminder that the quietest voices are often the most profound. He is the man who looked at the crown and looked at the woman he loved and didn't hesitate for a second. He made the trade, seen from the outside, a scholarly figure in a tweed coat, settled in his chosen life. It is easy to argue that he got the better deal. The story of George Windsor, Earl of St Andrews, is more than a footnote in royal history. It is a moral fable about the collision between the human heart and the machinery of the state. For 27 years, the law placed him on the wrong side of a religious test. He lived with that quietly and without public complaint until Parliament finally amended the rules and acknowledged that such a test should no longer exist. His life exposes the fragility of the divine right. It shows us that royal status is not God-given. It is man-made, regulated by parliaments and prejudices. But it also shows us the resilience of love. George Windsor surrendered his proximity to power to preserve his proximity to truth. He will never be King George VII. His face will never be on a stamp or a banknote. But in the private history of the House of Windsor, the history written in the memories of its members rather than in statute books, his story carries an unusual weight. He is, in a very real sense, the king of his own life. And in the end, that is the only kingdom worth ruling.